Hello, I'm Bob, and this is my dream boat. Years ago, a very good friend of mine's father sketched this boat design on a placemat. He had that hanging on the wall of his youngest son's workshop. Having seen it many times, my fire was lit to build this design. This design was made by John Hacker from previous boats that he had built as Gold Cup racers. The hull itself is very similar to the Gold Cup hull shape. We attempted to put this design on CAD using some free CAD software, and I'm afraid to say I failed at it, so I decided to loft it. My friend's brother did get this design put on CAD, and that is what the foam model has been made with. With the lofting done, it's time to start the build. I changed the design from 18'6" to 25 foot and added enough beam to get 2 seats wide. I'd been saving mahogany and white oak for 30 years or more with the intent of someday building a boat. Having seen in different magazines pictures of laminated ribs, I chose this method. So first I created an easel. The easel allowed me to put the lofting lines on and then set up blocks so that the steamed wood could be bent in place to create the shape. I started out with a commercial steamer or store-bought steamer, which failed me after only 2 frames, so I decided to design and build my own steam generator. Started laminating the largest of the frames first. Because of the clamping scenario, I had to make the big first and then cut the easel back to be able to easily clamp the smaller frames. Continued this process until all 24 frames were made. Next, I formed the strong back to use for laminating the keel. Because the boat design has a stepped bottom, it means there are 2 keels, an aft keel and a bow keel. This worked out great because of my limited space in my workshop. So the front or bow portion of the keel was 15 foot long and the aft portion was about 13 feet long. Once the keels were done and the strong back was made, the floors were screwed onto the keel and then the frames were set up accordingly. A small red mark was made on each frame as a common center line so a laser could be used for alignment. With the frame set up and the chines and shear installed, we worked out the bow detail. With the bow detail done, it was time to put the deck battens on. Once the frame was rolled over, we did the bottom battens. With the bow 15 foot of the boat roughed in, we start the aft section or back portion of the hull. All of the frames were made, including the transom. This back section was now assembled and aligned. With it all screwed together, it was time to work out the cockpit details. Time to assemble the entire hull. With all the frames, battens, and stringers assembled, it became a very strong structure. And now it was time to start putting the side skins on. With the structure and framework completed, it's time to reinforce the sides of the boat. Both sides were first have a layer of 3/16 inch thick Western red cedar coated in epoxy applied on a 45-degree angle to create a strong and stiff side panel. After the Western red cedar was applied, both sides of the hull were completely coated with a layer of carbon fiber cloth saturated in epoxy. The entire hull was done that way on both sides, and it created a very, very strong and stiff structure, as you can see in those photos. Skinning the bottom of the boat now is the next project. We started out with 1/4-inch sheets of marine quality plywood, coated them, fitted them to each side of the bottom, screwed and glued the first layer to the hull, and then strictly glued but screwed the perimeter of the second layer to create a very strong and stiff bottom, 1/2 of an inch thick, with 2 layers of 1/4-inch marine grade plywood. The corners were reinforced with carbon fiber, and then the entire bottom was covered in carbon fiber cloth, saturated again with epoxy. This made for a very nice, clean, neat looking bottom of the boat. We then faired that with the sanding equipment, and it turned out really good. The entire bottom was coated with a marine grade high build primer. This gave us perfect surface to fair and sand to get a nice, beautiful, smooth bottom. That then was painted with a red marine epoxy paint and gave a very good finish. Skinning the deck. The first thing that was done was a check of all the fairing of all the battens, making sure they were good. Then a layer of 1/8-inch marine quality plywood was glued and screwed to the battens. This was continually faired as we progressed till all deck surfaces were covered with the 1/8-inch skin. The boat was starting to look like its model. Planking of the hull. We first started to plank the sides of the hull using 1/4-inch mahogany. Okay, the mahogany was wetted out initially. A mixture of epoxy and microfibers was then applied to the plank itself, as well as the surface of the carbon fiber was wetted out. And each plank was applied one at a time using multiple weights to hold it in place. Clamps were necessary. The entire side was finished, and then the boat was flipped over and the opposite side was also planked. This was all done before starting the decks. Planking of the top deck surface started by the shear planks. Shear planks were first mocked up in the 1/8-inch plywood and then cut out of the 3/8-inch thick mahogany and glued to the hull as shown in the photos. Once that was done, the center line of the deck was established and the first strips to create the deck were applied and glued on. The strips were approximately 1.5-inch wide by 3/8-inch thick. Special clamps were created to continually add these strips over the entire hull. Once the entire hull was stripped with this layer of mahogany, it was time to start sanding and fairing it all in and make it look good. We started out using a very coarse 60 grit paper on multiple sanding devices and found that it was taking forever to get the deck down to where we needed it. So we took a small block plane, very sharp, and worked the deck on a 45-degree angle, and that worked exceptionally well. As we progressed from the block plane to the 60 grit, to 80 grit, to 110 grit, eventually 220 grit, and in many incidences 400 grit paper. We used chalk and battens to continually check the deck and make sure it was extremely fair before taking it to the final sanding step. The final 220 and 400 grit paper was run with the grain to eliminate any of the angular cuts that were made with the coarser grits. Before staining, I put together a sample of the different pieces of wood that were on the deck and tried different applications of the stain with different grits of sanding as shown in the sample. It looked pretty good, so we went ahead and applied a coat of epoxy to the sample first to see what the final color was going to look like. Everybody was happy, so we hit it and continued to apply this stain over the 220 grit sanding of the entire hull. We put the first coat of West epoxy over the stain and sanded that lightly to make sure it was nice and fair before putting the second coat. With each coat, the hull continued to glass over. In the one picture, you can see the combings around the cockpit with stain and then with the first coat of epoxy. The hull was really starting to look very good. Taking the boat out for its first showing, we installed the boat on its trailer and added the forms for the bucket seats as well as some of the other hardware to take it to the Presque Harbor Wooden Boat Show in June of 2022. As these photos show, we pulled the boat out of the barn and got it ready to take north. So at the boat show, the boat drew quite a large crowd and was a hit for the day, which made all of us who worked so hard on it to this point feel good. We still have to install all of the hardware and the engine and drivetrain, and that will be part of some of the videos that will follow, as well as more detailed description of each of the processes as we go.